Well, thanks for remembering to be back tonight. I know after we have tonight and we have next Wednesday, and then we'll be done. So we have tonight and then next Wednesday, and then we'll be done for a while. So, and all of our faith break will be actually done except for the youth for our student ministries for a little while. And this is getting to be tonight. I'm going to get to probably my favorite part of church history. So it's really the part that I enjoy the most thinking about and learning about and teaching about. And as we get to the beginning that leads into the Reformation, it is, I think, the most fascinating part of church history, and it's also what really helps us to understand a little bit more about how we get to where we are now. So I think we'll launch in, and I would appreciate your prayers. I have shingles.
Oh no.
And it's not contagious, so you don't have to worry about that. But I went to the doctor Monday, and they assured me it is not, well, actually yesterday. I went to the doctor yesterday. They assured me it's not contagious unless you are under 1 year old. Because you can get chicken pox from somebody who has shingles, and 1 year olds are.
Babies.
Huh? You have to stay away from my little guys, from Charlotte and Essie, for about a week. But otherwise, don't have to worry about passing it to anybody. But if anybody else here ever had shingles?
2 years ago.
Okay. Not a lot of fun, is it?
No. I got the shingles shot, though, a year ago.
Okay. Well, that's what I'm planning on doing as soon as after this. So, yeah, it's not just a super bad case, but it's not fun either. So, hopefully. But it doesn't keep me from doing what I need to do, but yeah, I'd rather just get to the end of it as quickly as I can. So, anyway, we had gotten up to the beginning of the Renaissance, the end of the Middle Ages last week. And when we get to the end of the Middle Ages and get really to that turning point of right around the year 1500, things really start happening in rapid succession that change the landscape in lots of ways. Some of them sad, and some of them exciting, and some of them just frustrating. Almost at that time, just a few years before that milestone of the 1500, in 1453, we talked about how Constantinople was the center of the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church. Well, in 1453, the Muslim Turks, captured Constantinople, and the main church there, the mother church of the Orthodox Church, St. Sophia's in Constantinople, was turned into a mosque. And that was a real turning point in the so-called Orthodox wing of the church as Islam continued to take over more and more territory. On the Christian side of things, the papacy has really the height of its power in Europe in terms of being able to really dictate to kings and queens and rulers. And one of the things that happened right around late 1400s was the decision to build a new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To build a new, magnificent St. Peter's Basilica there at the Vatican. And it was a very ambitious idea to build this magnificent church. But where to get the money? And that question is going to come into play here shortly. Where to get the money to build St. Peter's Basilica? So hold on to that for a couple of minutes. I had a book, and I maybe even mentioned this as we were kind of foreshadowing. I had a book that was published in the year 2000, and the title of the book was The 100 Most Significant Events of the Last 1,000 Years. In other words, the most significant events between the year 1000 and the year 2000. And I think I may have already given that away, what was number one. Did I mention what's number one of the most significant events of the last 1,000 years? Huh?
Printing press, you mentioned that.
Yeah, the invention of the printing press. The invention of the printing press. In 1456, Johann Gutenberg printed a copy of the Bible in Latin. Probably heard of the Gutenberg Bibles. But this was the first use under Gutenberg, the first use of movable type. And the use of movable type in a printing press changes the world. As I say, I think only history can judge what ends up being significant. I mean, I think the closest thing in our lifetime, or at least in my lifetime, to this is the smartphone, in terms of how much it changes our daily lives. As I think about life before the smartphone, life after the smartphone, in terms of just what it means in terms of accessing information, connecting to people, having, at your fingertips, the weather, the stock market, sports scores, trivia questions, on and on and on and on. I mean, in terms of just the ability to access information at a moment's notice. I think the smartphone will go down as the most significant invention of the last 100 years at least. But the last 1,000 years, the most significant invention is the printing press. Because before the printing press, every book had to be copied by hand. Now, I think, as I said last time, a couple of weeks ago, if you want to have a Bible, it was going to be a hand-copied copy of the Bible, which would take a friar, a monk in a monastery, a year to make one copy of the Bible, working all day long, copying precisely, carefully the Bible. So books were incredibly expensive, only accessible to maybe one per church, and the very wealthy, and the vast, vast majority of people couldn't read. 90+% of people in Europe were illiterate, couldn't read, because there was nothing for them to learn to read from. The invention of the printing press changes everything in lots of ways. It changes literacy rates, it changes access to information, it changes access to the Bible, primarily, and other information. In terms of knowledge being able to be spread, science, literature, on and on and on and on. I mean, you can't underestimate how much the printing press changes life. To think about a world before there was printing, when the only way you could access anything was a hand-copied copy of something. It's a huge shift in culture, and that's going to play into lots of places, including the history of the church, the history of Christianity. Now, around a little bit after the invention of the printing press, another really dark place we talked about around the year 1000. One of the two darkest places in Christian history being the Crusades. When the Crusaders marched to the Holy Land, slaughtered the Muslims, and how over the next couple of hundred years the Holy Land changed hands between Christianity and Islam 2 or 3 times, until Saladin conquered it for Islam, and it stayed in Muslim hands for centuries after that. And how along the way, how many people were slaughtered, how much death, how the last crusade, the so-called Crusaders from the West slaughtered Eastern Christians on their way to the Holy Land. It is a dark spot in the history of Christianity. And I think, as I also said, memory is a very long thing, because go back to 9/11, which doesn't seem like that was 20 years ago or 21 years ago, but it was. The rhetoric among radical Islam refers to those of us in the West, those of us in America, as crusaders. That's still the name given to people in the West. They're still called crusaders because of what happened 1,000 years ago. So memory goes back a long, long time. So that was one of two very dark spots in Christian history. The other dark spot is around 1479. 1479, something else begins, the Spanish Inquisition. Any Monty Python fans? Because, of course, in Monty Python, when anyone says the word Spanish Inquisition, someone would pop up and say, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition begins, the idea being to root out heresy, to root out heretics. It was instigated by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, that you know from other parts of history. Mainly it was seeking Christians who did not have the right beliefs, or who didn't have correct beliefs, and also it ended up persecuting Jews and Muslims, and then later on down the road, Protestants. The Spanish Inquisition used torture, imprisonment, execution to try to root out heresy. And it was conducted primarily by Franciscan and Dominican friars. And, it conjures up horrible images of people literally being tortured and forced to convert to Christianity under threat of torture. The opposite of anything that you could possibly take out of the New Testament. The opposite of anything that you could imagine Jesus telling his followers to do in terms of making disciples. So the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition in particular, is a terrible, terrible dark spot in the history of Christianity. And it was finally condemned by the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1820. So, only 350 years later. So, when I say it's a low point for the church, of course at this point we're still talking, at least in the West, about the Roman Catholic Church, and it was a low point in the corruption of the Vatican and the corruption of the papacy. At this point, one of the Pope Alexander VI, before he became Pope Alexander VI, his given name was Rodrigo Borgia. You heard of the Borgias? Like Lucretia Borgia, the Borgia family. The Borgia family is today we would basically call them a mafia family, a crime family in Italy, the Borgias. The Borgias were an incredibly powerful, corrupt family in Italy. And Rodrigo Borgia was the father. He had several mistresses, he had several illegitimate children, but he had the power and the money to bribe the cardinals to elect him pope. And so imagine basically the equivalent of a mafia leader becoming the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's what happens in the later part of the 1400s when Rodrigo Borgia becomes the pope. And so the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church reaches its low point at that point. Now, 1492 is the date we think of course, in history. It's when Columbus sails and, quote, discovers America. There was already people here. But he discovers America, which does open up doors eventually for both exploitation and missionary efforts. When I was studying with Rabbi Rubin at OU, he said in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and Isabella and Ferdinand expelled the Jew. All three of those, both of those things happened in 1492. The Jews were expelled from Spain, and they also financed Christopher Columbus' exploration. The Jews came under persecution in Spain and were forced to leave Spain in that same year. So, things are happening. In the year 1500, actually no, the year 1506, they lay the foundation stone, the cornerstone, for the new St. Peter's Basilica. This new, magnificent church that's going to be built with the tomb of St. Peter. Now, there was already a chapel there, the Sistine Chapel. In 1506, a fellow named Michelangelo paints the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We're all familiar with, or at least most of us are familiar with what that famous painting looks like on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Which, has anyone, I've been there once. Anyone else been to the Sistine Chapel? You're supposed to, when we went to Italy and went to Rome, we got to go into the Vatican and got to go into the Sistine Chapel. And there are people there continually shushing you. Because you're supposed to not talk in the Sistine Chapel. But of course everybody is. So every 10 seconds there's somebody shushing you. As you're in there, packed in there like sardines. They're going shh, shh, shh. As you're looking up, but people keep talking no matter how much shushing happens. So that's happening. But the Basilica, the modern St. Peter's, they just laid the foundation in 1506. Now, the printing press has been invented, so now you can have Bibles. And now, of course, the first Gutenberg Bible is in Latin, which is the language of scholars and the language of the church, Latin. But in 1516, a scholar named Erasmus publishes a Greek New Testament. And that's significant because the Greek New Testament that's published and printed in 1516 becomes the basis for almost all modern, or at least at that time, modern Bible translations. It's what's used for the King James, for example. The King James Bible uses Erasmus's Greek New Testament as its basis. Luther's German Bible uses that same Bible as its basis. So, speaking of Luther, we get to the year 1517. And 1517 is the significant year for what we call the Protestant Reformation. Now, because I know this is online and out there on the internet, let me just say one thing, and I kind of say when I teach this area of church history to confirmation classes. What I'm going to say about what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church in the early 1500s is what was happening in the Roman Catholic Church 500 years ago. Much of the corruption and much of the mistakes and much of the problems in the Catholic Church 500 years ago don't exist today. Much of this has been dealt with. Much of this is not the way the Catholic Church is today. So for folks who may be watching this who are Roman Catholic friends or who have Roman Catholic friends, don't mistake what the Catholic Church was like 500 years ago for what it's like today. Much of the corruption and the things that I'm going to talk about have been dealt with since then. Okay? So, we have, yes.
How did Martin Luther escape the Inquisition?
Well, I'll get that. Let's talk about Martin Luther. Martin Luther, he's a German. He is the eldest son. His father is a tradesman. Luther is very bright. And his father has a dream for Luther to become a lawyer. And so Martin Luther's father sends him to get educated, to go to college, or at least the version of college that existed then, and was on his way to becoming a lawyer. But he was also a devout young man. And one night, Luther is returning home from school back to his home, and he gets caught in a lightning strike, in a lightning storm. And Luther is terrified that he is going to be struck by lightning. And as he's terrified, he cries out, "Saint Anne, save me, and I shall become a priest." Saint Anne being the name given to Mary's mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus' mother. "Saint Anne, save me, and I shall become a priest." Well, he survives the lightning storm, and now feels he has made a vow that he cannot break, that he now must become a priest. His father is very upset because he's paid for his schooling. He wants him to be a lawyer and make money. But Martin Luther now feels compelled that he must, what he sees as a binding vow to God, to become a priest. So, he enters a monastery and becomes a priest, becomes a monk. And Luther's personality was such that he was terrified of God. He was terrified of God's judgment. He was terrified of God's wrath. He was terrified of punishment for his sins. So there in the monastery, as a monk, he would go to confess, go to the confession booth, go to confess his sins 3 or 4 hours a day every day. He would spend 3 or 4 hours a day in confession every day. You think, how many sins can you really commit in a monastery? That you would take 3 or 4 hours a day to confess them. He was confessing every wayward thought, every what he thought of as impure thought. He was obsessed with his own sin. And he wrote that in his later reflecting on that time, Luther said, I lost touch with Christ, the Savior and Comforter, and made him my jailer and hangman of my soul. I lost touch with Christ, the Savior and Comforter, and made him the jailer and hangman of my soul. So, Luther is obsessed with his own sin. The leader of the monastery, the lead friar, basically, this is a little modern way of putting it. It was like, we got to give this guy something to do, He knew that Luther was a brilliant man, had a brilliant mind. So he told Luther to go get a degree in theology to become a professor of theology, to teach at the seminary level, which Luther does. And Luther quickly gets a degree in theology, gets a doctorate in theology, and becomes a professor, a lecturer at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. So Luther quickly fulfills all the requirements to be a lecturer, to be a professor of theology. And he starts to lecture on the New Testament. And as he's, studying in the original languages, as he's studying, line by line, the words, especially of Paul, as he's studying the book of Romans, as he's studying Corinthians, as he's studying Galatians, as he's studying the letters of Paul to lecture on them, he starts to realize, at least in his mind, that what the Catholic Church is teaching doesn't line up with the Bible. He starts seeing that what he's reading and studying in the Scriptures doesn't line up with the official teachings of the Catholic Church. And the thing that he thinks is most out of line with the Bible is the idea of indulgences. Indulgences. Okay, so this requires us to think a little bit about Catholic theology 500 years ago. Some of which is still part of Catholic theology today, some of which is not part of Catholic theology today. Catholic theology believes that there's not just that the soul does not just have two destinations, heaven and hell. Catholic theology says there's also something called purgatory. Most of you, even though you're Protestants, probably have at least heard the name purgatory. It's not the ski place, the actual idea of purgatory. And the Catholic teaching is that when a Christian dies, most Christians do not go to heaven. They go to purgatory. Now, non-Christians just go to hell, but in Catholic teaching. But most Christians don't go directly to heaven. They first go to purgatory. Purgatory in Catholic teaching, well, you get the word purge is part of purgatory. Purgatory in Catholic teaching is, if I die, I'm a Christian, but I am still full of sin. I'm still tainted with all kinds of imperfections. I've still got all kinds of sort of spiritual gunk attached to my soul. So the idea is you would go to purgatory and be purged of all those impurities and all that stuff before you would be made ready to enter into heaven. And of course, for most people, purgatory would be several hundred years of purging before you're ready for heaven. So that's Catholic teaching, that people would go to purgatory first, and then, after a few hundred years of purging, would then be ready for heaven. Unless you're basically a saint. There are those people who are so saintly, who are so godly, who are so close to God that they go straight to heaven. They don't have to go through purgatory. They don't have to pass go and collect $200. They go straight to heaven. But most people, the Catholic Church says, have to go to purgatory. And that's the Catholic teaching, and that is still Catholic teaching today. Catholics still teach that there is purgatory today. But in the 1500s, at least, they taught there is a way to shorten your time in purgatory. There's a way to reduce your time in purgatory. And that was what was called a papal indulgence. A papal indulgence. Okay. So here's what that is. The idea, and I'm not going to use the board, but imagine there's saints, like the apostles, or the saintliest person of all in Catholic teaching, which would be who? Mary, Jesus' mom, would be, in Catholic teaching, the most saintly person ever. Okay. So you got these saintly people like Mary and the apostles and other saints. They not only get to go straight to heaven, they've got, and this is a little bit, I won't say crude, but it's not theological language, but to put it in really blunt terms, they've got extra credit holiness. Okay? They not only have enough holiness to go straight to heaven, they've got an overabundance of holiness. They've got extra credit holiness. And that extra, and of course, who has more than Mary? Mary would have the most of anyone. Well, where is that extra credit holiness? Well, in the Catholic teaching, there is something called the treasury of merit. Okay? The treasury of merit. So, this extra credit holiness, this treasury of merit, is like this bank account with credit in it that could reduce your time in purgatory. Well, how do you get a hold of some of that? Well, guess who has the strings, who controls that treasury of merit? The Pope. Of course, the Pope. So the idea being, I'm Joe Catholic. I know my life's imperfect. I'm worried about those 300 or 400 years in purgatory because it doesn't sound real pleasant, because the word purge doesn't sound real pleasant. I would like to have a couple of hundred years knocked off of that time in purgatory. How do I get some of that extra credit? Well, I have to get it from the Pope. Well, what do I do? How do I get the Pope to indulge me and give me a papal indulgence? By doing something great for the church. By doing something helpful to the church. And what, in the early 1500s, could be more helpful to the church than giving money to build St. Peter's Basilica? Okay. So, the idea was, I make a donation to St. Peter's Basilica. And in recognition of that, I get a papal indulgence saying, 100 years off your time in purgatory. So the Vatican, the Pope, had salesmen all over the place selling indulgences, selling people papal indulgences. In exchange for an offering to the church, here's how many years you have off your time in purgatory. Or your dead mother's time, who's already in purgatory. Or your dead father's time. Or your dead grandparents' time. Or your dead sister's time. Or on and on and on. So, do you see what a money-making gold mine this is? Now, what really got Luther really upset was there was one indulgence salesman in Germany by the name of Tetzel. And the English translation of his slogan, his slogan was, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." He wasn't even trying to couch it in any real spiritual term other than this is a cash and carry arrangement. This much money gives you this much time off in purgatory. Well, this drove Luther nuts. He's looking through, as he's studying the New Testament, there's nothing in there about indulgences. There's also nothing in there about purgatory. None of that is in the New Testament. None of that's in the Bible. So, Luther, as a scholar and a professor of theology and as a professor of New Testament, says, well, and this is maybe where, at least the beginning, he's a little bit naive. He's like, well, this is, the church has got this wrong. They need to fix this. And so as a scholar, he writes up a document with 95 places where the church's theology doesn't match the Bible. It can be known as the 95 Theses. He's like, here's 95 places where the teachings of the church don't match the teachings of the New Testament. But his focus was on indulgences. That's the red letter part of this problem, is the indulgences. And he, as a scholar, says this needs to be debated and discussed among theologians. We need to debate this and discuss this and get the church to change this. So he, on October 31, 1517, October 31st, 1517, Luther takes the document, the 95 Theses, and nails it to the door of the church in Wittenberg. Which, I used to think about this as like, him like he's, that was like the community bulletin board. The church door was where you posted notices. Okay? This is before Facebook. So, he posts the 95 Theses on the church door of Wittenberg, expecting debate and discussion. He also sends a copy to his bishop. I say somewhat naively, maybe thinking, okay, well, let's talk about this. Now, how do you think that was received by the bishops and the cardinals and the popes and the pope and all those folks?
Not well.
Not well. Because who is this little German monk think he is to tell us that we're wrong about all these things, that the teaching of the church? Because including, not only did he question that indulgences were biblical, he questions that the Pope had that kind of authority. He questions the authority of the Pope on several things. Why would the Pope have this authority to grant this? Why would the Pope have the authority to do this? He also, maybe not so naively, one of them was like, why is the Pope not using his vast money to build this church instead of trying to get poor peasants to pay for it? So he sends this letter, he posts it on the church door. These are 95 places where he says the church is not biblical. Well, had there not been this little thing called the printing press, this might have never turned into something. But there is a printing press. And Luther's friends get a hold of this document. Now, Luther wrote it, of course, in Latin, the language of scholarship. His friends translated it into German, printed up, distributed all over Germany. Then it gets to France. It gets to Italy. It gets to England. This document starts to be dispersed throughout Christendom, throughout Europe. It spreads like wildfire because of the printing press. And suddenly, everybody's talking about this because in the last, 30 or 40 years, the literacy rate has gone up dramatically, and others, at least, are having it read to them. So, of course, Luther is told, you're wrong. Because Luther, the Catholic Church basically, and again, some of this would not be fair to say about the modern Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church basically said that the authority of the Church is greater or equal to the authority of Scripture. That the tradition of the Church basically and the Pope can overrule, and only the Pope can interpret Scripture. That only the Pope can interpret correctly the Scriptures. Luther insists that the core doctrine of the New Testament, especially of Paul, especially of Romans, is salvation not by works, but by faith. Salvation by grace through faith. That where he sees that as Paul's main point in Romans, and Luther says this is the heart of the teaching of, especially of the letters of Paul. That we're not saved by deeds, we're not saved by good works, we're not saved by what we do, we're only saved by what Christ did on the cross. We're only saved by His payment of our sins. We can't buy our salvation, we can't earn our salvation, we can only receive the gift of salvation from Christ. Salvation through grace by faith. That is Luther's main point. That he says this is what the Bible teaches. And all this stuff he questions purgatory, he questions the authority of the Pope, and the existence of purgatory, and all the indulgences, all these things. So, of course, he's told, take it all back, Luther, recant. He's brought to trial for being a heretic, for heresy. Especially for what he said that the Pope can't do. He's called a heretic for saying the Pope can't grant indulgences and doesn't have that authority. So, he is finally brought to trial. He's found guilty. He is condemned as a heretic. But by this time, the church wheels move kind of slowly. From the time he wrote it until the time he's brought to trial is about 3 years. During that time, some of the secular rulers buy into what Luther's saying. Their motives may or may not have been somewhat impure. Because some of the secular rulers who read Luther's things like, wait a minute, you mean the Pope doesn't have authority over me? You mean the Pope doesn't have the power over me? Say some of the secular rulers. So one of the secular rulers spirits Luther away and puts him in a castle to keep him safe, away from being able to be arrested. And it is while he's under sort of protective custody that he translates the scriptures into German, which is the first time that's happened. He writes even more and more pamphlets and treatises and things where he starts to get more and more bold in his criticism of the Catholic Church. He criticizes the Mass because in the Catholic Church, every time the Mass is said, it is Jesus' body is being re-sacrificed. The Catholics have a teaching called transubstantiation, where the host, the bread, and the wine literally are transformed miraculously into the body and blood of Christ. Luther criticizes that. He criticizes the need for Christians to go and confess their sins to a priest. He criticizes the whole idea of monks and nuns and the monastic life. The celibacy of the priesthood. He starts just ticking off all of the various things that he says are not biblical about the Catholic Church. He marries a nun. They have 6 children. He becomes, the spokesperson for this movement. And of course, we call it the Protestant Reformation. Protestant because Luther was protesting. He was protesting what he saw as all these abuses of the Catholic Church. It was called the Reformation because his idea was to reform the church. But instead of reforming the church, of course, it ends up splitting the church. It ends up splitting the church. And that becomes the first fissure, the first split of Christianity, major split, is 500 years earlier, when the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, basically excommunicate each other. And we end up with the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's the first major division of Christianity into 2 halves. But now Western Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church now splitters into Roman Catholic and Protestant. Now, of course, the Protestant wing itself is not just one monolithic wing. In Germany, it comes to be known as Lutheranism, the Lutheran Church after Luther. But Luther has started something now that others chime in, others jump on this bandwagon. People like John Calvin, people like Zwingli, people in other countries and other writers and other things. And this Protestant movement begins to grow and grow and spread. Now, there are some responses to that. One response is the Catholic Church says, well, we've got to fight back. What's usually called the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation. In other words, the Catholic Church fighting back against Protestantism. And part of that would be the Inquisition. Part of that is the formation of a new order called the Jesuits. And the Jesuits are sort of the theological warriors of the Catholic Church, pushing back against the Protestant movement. The other thing that happens, so there's a pushback from the Catholic Church that's usually referred to as the Counter-Reformation. There's also, as with any movement, there's some people who think Luther didn't go far enough. Because Luther doesn't throw out everything. Even though Luther comes out against purgatory, indulgences, the celibacy of priests, monasteries, confessional booths, some of these, he doesn't completely throw out the idea that there has to be some structure and authority in the church, that there has to be some order, that it can't just be totally free-for-all. He also doesn't, some of the people who read Luther's writings see his opposition to the authority of the church, of the Catholic Church, and the authority of the Pope. They say, oh, he's against all authority. Kings, rulers, aristocrats, landowners, etc. Some of the peasants believe this is a call to revolution against any authorities. And there's what's called the Peasants' Revolt. Luther is not at all behind that. He's not at all behind this sort of anarchy that some people think he's calling for. There's also theologically people who think he hasn't gone far enough. That's usually referred to as the Radical Reformation. And the Radical Reformation, sometimes called the Anabaptists, because the Radical Reformation rejects infant baptism. Luther kept infant baptism. There were some who said, no, we should only have believer baptism. And they believed that every congregation should be totally independent with no structure beyond that local congregation. And so that's usually called the Radical Reformation. And you can see the roots of that springing up in Christianity as well. Now, theologically, probably the other big name that we think of when we think of the Reformation, other than Martin Luther, is John Calvin. John Calvin is one of the other major architects of the Reformation. Luther was brilliant, but Luther was not what would be called a systematic theologian. In other words, but John Calvin was. Calvin wrote very dense theology, very dense theological treatises. Calvin is usually, of course, considered the father of what today we would call Presbyterian, the Presbyterian Church. When you think of John Calvin, what's one doctrine you probably associate with him? You know what doctrine is usually associated with John Calvin? Predestination. Predestination. Yeah, predestination. Calvin was a staunch advocate of the doctrine usually referred to either as predestination or double predestination. And the way that you're taught this in seminary is with the word tulip, T-U-L-I-P, okay, tulip. The T of predestination stands for total depravity, which in other words, every single human is full of sin, totally depraved. Of course, depraved is kind of a strong word, but it's basically every human is full of sin. T is for total depravity. U is for unconditional election. Unconditional election. Predestination teaches that from the beginning of time, God destined some humans to be saved and some humans to be damned. Predestination says that from the beginning of time, God decided these people are going to go to heaven and these people are going to go to hell. These people are destined for heaven. These people are destined for hell. So that's U is unconditional election. L is for limited atonement. In other words, that the atonement of Christ on the cross was only for those who were who were already been predestined to be saved. But the atonement is limited to those who are predestined. The I is for irresistible grace. Those who are predestined to be saved cannot resist Christ. It is irresistible. And P is perseverance of the saints, which a Baptist might call once saved, always saved in the modern Baptist church. Now, all of that to say, the Calvinist way of teaching was that every single human is either predestined to salvation or damnation. Now, just to jump ahead, because we'll get there tonight, but to get to John Wesley, Wesley rejected predestination. We Methodists reject predestination. John Wesley said to his Calvinist friend, John Wesley said to his Calvinist friend, to believe in predestination turns God into a devil. So, as Wesleyans, that is not part of our theology. Now, what's surprising, especially when I taught sort of intro to Methodism to folks who grew up in a Presbyterian church or who grew up in a Southern Baptist church, they believe in predestination. Now, a lot of folks who grew up in the Baptist church said, well, no, I don't believe in that. And I was like, well, you probably don't, but officially the Southern Baptist Church's teaching has been of predestination. So is the Lutherans. So are many other denominations. Although, if you look today at the websites of a lot of Presbyterian churches and Southern Baptist churches, they basically say, well, we're not too sure about that. They kind of waffle on that idea of predestination. But that is, John Calvin is the architect of this firm, very rigid idea of predestination that is best known in the Presbyterian Church. But if you go to somewhere like, say, Kirk of the Hills, and look at their website, they'll say, well, we don't necessarily believe that. But that is part of the heritage of that wing of the church. So out of the Reformation comes a lot of different, branches. Now, get to the maybe what's, and again, as it gets closer and closer to where we are Protestant Christians, at least as Methodists, we are Protestant Christians. We are part of this heritage that goes back to Martin Luther. But there's a step between Luther and Wesley. Okay? And how do we get there? Well, we got to go to England. Okay? And here's where we start to get a little bit closer to understanding where we came from. During all this turbulence in Europe, all this Protestant movement, all this upheaval, the King of England is Henry VIII. Probably one of the most well-known English kings, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, and most people when they hear Henry VIII, they think, oh, he's the guy who had 6 wives, right? Yes, the guy had 6 wives. Henry VIII was a loyal Roman Catholic. Henry VIII thought of himself as a loyal Roman Catholic. He was the second son of his father, Henry VII. His brother was supposed to be the next king, because Henry was the second, Henry VIII, he was the second son. When his older brother was of age, when he was very young, his older brother married Catherine of Aragon, the Princess of Spain. Okay? Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So, Henry's older brother married Catherine of Aragon, the Princess of Spain. As most royal marriages in that day were political alliances. Princes married princesses and things like that. Then, he died 4 months later after he married her. At that point, Henry is still a child. He's like, 9, 10 years old. So, Catherine is now a widow. The idea is, well, what are we going to do about that? Well, the idea is we're going to wait until Henry is old enough to marry her and declare that that first marriage didn't count because they never consummated it. So finally, Henry, when he's 17, marries his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, and is now in line to be the king when his father dies. They start to have children. She has 4 stillborn children in a row. Stillborn. Finally, she gives birth to a daughter who lives, Mary. So, 1 child, but no son. And of course, in those days, a king is supposed to have a son to succeed him. Henry was never too thrilled about marrying Catherine in the first place. She's 6 or 7 years older than him. All these all these stillborn children, etc., etc. He is a vigorous young man, and he takes many mistresses and has many affairs at court. The one that is best known at the time is Anne Boleyn. First, he has an affair with Anne's sister, and then he has one with Anne. So he has an affair with Anne Boleyn and is very taken with her. By this time, by the time this rolls around, he's now 34 years old, and Catherine is 40. And the chances of her producing a male heir are getting slimmer and slimmer. And so, Henry wants to have his marriage to Catherine annulled so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. But they've been married by this time for 17 years. They can't say they never consummated the marriage after having, 4 stillborn children and a child married. So to get that marriage annulled, guess whose permission is needed? The Pope. So, through all the channels, the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the other Catholic leaders in England, there is communication with the Vatican. How can we make this happen? How can we...
Hey folks, Larry Varvel. Last night, Wednesday night, our Acts and Beyond study, the live stream got cut off at about the 1 hour mark. So those of you who are watching online missed about the last 15 or 20 minutes. So we're not sure what happened there. Hopefully it won't happen again, or we had a little technical difficulty. So let me finish off for you folks online what I was saying at the end, the last 15, 20 minutes of our session last night. I was beginning to talk about Henry VIII. Henry VIII, who is the King of England that is probably best well known for having 6 wives. Henry was the second son. His older brother was sickly, was not particularly healthy young man, but his older brother was married to a princess of Spain, Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. That was a political alliance, as often happened in those days, that a princess or a prince from one country would marry somebody from another country to cement a political alliance. So Catherine of Aragon of Spain is married to the firstborn son of Henry VII. However, 4 or 5 months into the marriage, that son dies, leaving Catherine of Aragon a young widow. Now what? Well, the younger brother, the next in line, Henry, who is going to become Henry VIII, he is still a young man, not of marrying age. So Catherine kind of hangs around for a few years. And finally, when Henry is 17, he is married then to Catherine of Aragon, his dead brother's wife, so that they could maintain the alliance. The expectation, of course, is that she will produce a son, an heir. Well, she gives birth to 4 stillborn children in a row. 4 births end in stillbirth. Finally, she produces a daughter, Mary. And that's the only child of the marriage that's produced. Now, in the meantime, she's getting older. Henry's getting older. He never particularly cared for Catherine. He was forced into the marriage. He is a young man who has many affairs with many women at court. The most famous, of course, is he has an affair with a young woman named Anne Boleyn. And he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. He wants to dissolve his marriage with Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. And Catherine is getting older, past the age of childbearing years. Henry's getting older. And so he wants to get that marriage annulled. But there's a problem. When a king wants to annul a marriage to a princess, you have to get special dispensation from guess who? From the Pope. And so that begins a process where Henry tries to get his marriage to Catherine annulled so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. Well, the Pope doesn't want to do that because that's going to anger the King and Queen of Spain. That's going to anger some of the other relatives of Catherine because all these royal families are all intermarried with each other. So the king, despite the king's pleas to the Pope is unwilling to grant an annulment of that marriage. And so Henry makes the huge decision to sever ties with Catholicism, to sever ties with Rome. And Henry declares himself the head of the Church of England. Henry VIII declares himself the head of the Church of England and makes the Church of England separate from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Henry had been a loyal supporter of the Catholic Church up to this point. He was not a fan of Martin Luther, but now, for obviously very mixed reasons, he declares himself the head of the Church of England. That happened in 1534. That ends up being a windfall for Henry because they begin to seize all of the church property in England, all the monasteries, all the convents, all the churches, all become property now of the crown. And this begins a new Protestant denomination. But the Church of England is kind of a hybrid between Protestantism and Catholicism. One of the things you'll notice about the Church of England then and now is, to those of us who are maybe Methodist or non-denominational or Lutheran or Presbyterian or some other Baptist, the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, also known here in America as the Episcopal Church, feels very Catholic to us. It feels very formal. The pastors are called priests. It seems very Catholic. Some people jokingly refer to the Episcopal Church as Catholic light. Episcopal priests are actually able to transfer and become Catholic priests. That's how you can have a handful of Catholic priests who were married, because they started off as Episcopal priests. So the Church of England is formed, and it's sort of the structure of the Catholic Church. The worship service is very similar to the Catholic Church, but with more Protestant ideas. And that explains why the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, feels almost like a hybrid between a Catholic Church and a Protestant church. So we have a new church, the Church of England. Well, eventually Henry dies, as all kings do, and he doesn't have an heir, he doesn't have a son. And so guess who becomes, I'm going to turn off my phone. He becomes, he's dead, and who becomes the new ruler and monarch of England? His daughter, Mary. Mary, the child that was born to Catherine of Aragon. And when Mary becomes the Queen of England, she wants to turn the country back to Catholicism because, of course, her mother, Catherine, was Catholic. She's raised as a Catholic. So Mary tries to turn England back to Rome, back to the Roman Catholic Church. But Mary only lives as queen for a couple of years before she dies. And when she dies, who's left? Well, her sister, her half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, becomes the Queen of England, Elizabeth I. And she becomes the longest reigning monarch in the history of England up until the current Queen, Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II has passed her. But up until our current Queen, Elizabeth I was the longest reigning monarch in England. And she had a lot of time to establish herself and to establish, now going back to Protestantism. And the Church of England now turns back to being a non-aligned with the Catholic Church, to being a Protestant church. Historians believe Elizabeth herself was not particularly religious one way or the other, but she felt that the Protestant church was a better political fit for England. And to this day, say the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, has kind of a Catholic feel in terms of the formal structure of the worship, in terms of how the service is ordered, the fact that the clergy call themselves priests, etc. But it also has a lot of Protestant aspects to it. The theology is firmly Protestant. Of course, the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth I for doing that, but she doesn't particularly care. Now, all of the British Isles are not Church of England. Scotland is very Presbyterian, thanks to the person who brings Protestantism to Scotland, John Knox. And you may have seen there's a lot of Presbyterian churches named after John Knox, but that Scotland becomes very Presbyterian. Now, around this same time, around the end of the 1500s, the beginning of the 1600s, the Jesuits, I mentioned earlier in this lecture, the Jesuits, who are a very aggressive form of Catholic evangelists, began to go on missions all over the world, the missionary movement of the Catholic Church. In 1603, there is a Dutch theologian named Jacob Arminius. Jacob Arminius. And Jacob Arminius is the father of what we call Arminianism. Now, when I say that, people think they're hearing Armenian, as in the country, but no, Jacob Arminius. And the reason he's an important person is because Jacob Arminius argues against the teachings of John Calvin, the teachings of predestination. Earlier last night I talked about how John Calvin believed in this very, very rigid form of predestination, that everyone, according to Calvin, everyone is born either destined for heaven or destined for hell. Jacob Arminius says no, the Bible teaches free will, that every person freely chooses salvation or chooses to reject God. And that teaching of free will is really the counterpoint to Calvinism. And most Protestant Christians are either Calvinist or Arminian. John Wesley is Arminian. So Methodism, our congregation, our denomination, is Arminian. We teach and preach and believe in free will. Some other churches, like the Presbyterian Church and even the Southern Baptist Church, are Calvinist. Although a lot of folks who grew up in those churches didn't realize they were Calvinist and actually would probably reject the teaching of predestination. Most Baptist churches don't really talk a lot about predestination, and some of them outright have denied that they teach that or believe that, and they're probably true. But the reason we know that the Baptist church is Calvinist is because there was a reaction against that and the formation of the Free Will Baptist Church. The Free Will Baptist Church was formed against the Calvinist Baptist Church, which was the dominant Baptist church. So if you've ever driven by and seen a Free Will Baptist Church, you know, okay, this is a Baptist church that believes in free will, as opposed to most Southern Baptist churches that were at least founded on the idea of Calvinism. So we are, as Methodists, we are Arminians. We believe in free will. In 1611, something very important happens. A Bible is published in English at the orders of King James. King James I of England had gathered a group of 34 Bible scholars, linguists, experts in Greek and Hebrew and all the rest, who translated a new translation of the English Bible out of the original languages. And since it was commissioned by King James, it was called the King James Version. And that comes out in 1611. And really for the next at least 300 years, the King James translation of the Bible is the dominant Bible translation. Some churches to this day still believe that it's the only authorized or the only authentic or the only authoritative translation of the Bible. Up until the middle of the 20th century, almost every Bible reading was done in the King James translation until there started to be some newer translation like the Revised Standard, and then in the 70s and 80s the Living Bible and the New International Version, and on and on. Now there's dozens of English translations of the Bible. But the King James is still the most beautiful, if not perhaps the one that is also difficult sometimes to read, because we don't talk the way people talked in 1611. It's 400 years later. We don't say thee and thine and thou anymore. We don't talk the way people talked in the early 1600s. It is beautiful language, especially for the Psalms. But if you're trying to read for real study and understanding, I would always advise and recommend a more modern English translation. The Old King James has some interesting use of language. The one I always mention, for example, is when you know the story when the mothers were bringing their children to Jesus to be blessed, and the disciples like, no, he's too busy. And then Jesus hears that they're pushing the children away and says, let the children come to me. Well, in the Old King James, that verse says, Jesus saying, suffer the children to come to me. Suffer the children to come to me. Suffer. Well, 400 years ago, the word suffer meant permit or allow. That's why when in this country there was a movement to get women to be allowed to vote, permitted to vote, it was called the Women's Suffrage Movement. But the word suffer doesn't really mean that anymore. When we say, we don't use the word suffer as a word that means permit or allow. But the King James uses the word suffer for the word that we would say allow or permit. That just shows you how much language has changed and why the King James is probably not always the best one to get the best meaning. If you want just beautiful language, this is the same language, the same time that the plays of Shakespeare were written. And so the language is beautiful, but sometimes a little confusing to a modern ear. So that happens in 1611. The New English Bible at the time, That's now 400 years old, the King James translation. Also in the early 1600s, in England, there were some who rejected the Church of England as being too close to Catholicism. There were some who felt that the Church of England had too many trappings that were reminiscent of the Catholic Church. The robes of the priest, the stained glass windows, the way in which the worship service was conducted. There were some who felt that the Church of England was still too, as they would say, too popish. And so they wanted something that they felt was a purer, simpler form of Christianity. They came to be known as, yes, you would guess, the Puritans. And the Puritans are a part of English history, and they're a part of our history too, because it is Puritans who come over on, the Mayflower and at Plymouth Rock and are the Pilgrims. Those are all Puritan Christians who rejected the Church of England and wanted something much more simple and, in their minds, more fundamental Christianity. Of course, the Puritans were a very strict form of Christianity, a very stern form of Christianity. You may remember they celebrated the first Thanksgiving, but they didn't celebrate any other holidays like Christmas or Easter. They thought that was too close to Catholicism to have holidays like that. But the Puritans have a great influence on the foundation of this country. The last thing I want to mention, the last thing I mentioned last night and that I'm mentioning now as I'm re-recording this last few bits, is also in the early 1600s, there was an astronomer by the name of Galileo. Galileo Galilei, but he usually just went by Galileo. And he published a theory in 1615, really following the writings and thinkings of Copernicus. He published a theory that said that the Earth rotates and moves around the sun. Now, that was contrary to what many people thought. People thought that no, the Earth was the center of the universe and that the planets and the sun and the stars all rotated around the Earth. Galileo said, well, no, as I've observed the heavens, as I've observed the stars, it's the Earth that rotates and it's the Earth that's moving around the sun. Well, this was considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be a heretical teaching, because they said the Bible teaches that the Earth is the center of the universe, and it talks about the sun rising and the sun setting. It even talks in the story of Joshua that one day in battle it said the sun stopped and the day was lengthened. And they said, therefore, the Bible teaches that the sun is the thing that's moving, not the Earth. And they called Galileo a heretic. They said his theories about the Earth moving around the sun were foolish, absurd, and heretical, and demanded that he retract his views and renounce and recant all of his views, under penalty of imprisonment and possibly death. And so Galileo reluctantly did as they asked, even though most scholars believe he knew in his heart he was right, but he recanted. Now that was 1615. In 1615, the church forced Galileo to recant his idea that the earth moves around the sun. How long do you think it took for the Roman Catholic Church to acknowledge that Galileo was right? How long do you think it took the Catholic Church to acknowledge that Galileo was right and that the earth actually does move around the sun? Well, the answer is October 31, 1992. That's right. 1992, just 30 years ago, Pope John Paul II acknowledged that the church was in error. Took, well, almost 400 years for the church to acknowledge that the earth moves around the sun. That's kind of maybe a lesson for all of us that biblical interpretation, you need to make sure how you're interpreting the Bible. And that was an argument about the sun and the earth that it became pretty clear that Galileo was right long before 1992. Matter of fact, that's quite a few years after the moon landing. But sometimes the wheels turn slowly. Now that's where I'm wrapping up, because next week, we're going to have, hopefully all our technology will be working well. Next week, I'm going to start in the Church of England with a boy born to a Church of England pastor, and this boy's name is John Wesley. and we'll dive into our own denomination, the Methodist Church, and then beyond, and then into the not only the 1800s but the 1900s and the 20th century as well, and how we get to the 21st century in the history of the church. Next week we'll wrap up, and as we continue to zoom through church history, we'll see what it looks like up to today, perhaps. So, thanks for your patience. Sorry it took our technology to get caught up with these last few minutes of last night's lesson. Thanks for tuning in last night, and thanks for tuning in now. And I say, join us next Wednesday as well as we finish up this study of Acts and beyond. Let's pray. Lord, for all that you've done in the history of your church, for the last 2,000 years, you've used fallible, sinful people like us to carry on. And yet, Lord, somehow each of us, the only reason we follow you is because someone in the previous generation shared the good news with us. And we thank you for every generation of followers that are a part of this great chain, unbroken chain, that we call the Church of Jesus Christ. Thank you for always guiding us and enlightening us. Thank you, Lord, that you send the Spirit of truth to help us. We pray in your name. Amen.